Hello and welcome to the Six Cells podcast. This is Mike Nicholson from Six Cells. Today I'm going to be speaking to Stephen Jenkins, the founder and managing director at Too Many Dreams. Stephen, how are you?
Yes, very good, Mike. How are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah, thanks for making the time to come in. Good to see you. As is traditional, why don't we start off with a little bit about your career to date that's led you to Too Many Dreams, and what about your first ever job? What was that? What does it entail?
Good question. Well, I suppose my first ever job was when I was still at university. I ended up setting up a company managing bands and DJs. I was at uni at Liverpool in the early 90s doing a maths and management degree, thinking I was going to be a management consultant. And then by lots of happy coincidences, worked for a magazine in my spare time, and then knew some DJs, set up a company managing a whole load of them. And that made me
putting
go
on gig nights and stuff like that. You mean?
Really promoting them into other clubs.
Okay.
So it was that early 90s era of like the mega clubs. So Cream, Back to Basics, Ministry, Tall Trees, all of that sort of thing. So we spent every weekend going around the country, going to various clubs, and that made me go, oh, there's this thing called the music industry. I want to work in that. So as soon as I graduated, I was down to London, get a job in music. So then I worked for a company called Lightning Export, running their kind of marketing department. The most notable thing about that, I think, was I met my friend Liz, who went on to become our best man many years later.
Okay.
And then worked for a bunch of record labels for 10 or so years, working with various artists like Grace Jones and Khalees and Jamie T and all sorts of artists, kind of helping run their careers. And a big part of that was running their campaigns around the rest of the world. So it was artists that was running the UK, and then I'd run their campaigns internationally.
So I flirted on the very outside of the music industry, and I agree. It does seem like an amazing thing to be able to work in. I work for a company called Blink TV that you probably know them, do the big screens at festivals and gigs and stuff like that. They were amazing years, like just going to festivals for free, being able to go backstage to use the loo. Like it seems like a really small thing, doesn't it? But that's enormous when you're in something like the V Festival or Glastonbury, and there's a queue a mile long. So what changed then? So how did you go from music to sort of
Technology.
more media marketing?
Yes, and so music was my big passion, and I loved it. I still do. And then 2007, 8. At that period, Napster and those sort of things were destroying the industry, or the traditional industry. And the iPhone came out, and I got approached about a role that was it was a trade association connecting the kind of nascent mobile industry with the content industry, and they wanted someone from the content background. And my limited vision was that anything you could digitize was going to end up on this device. So I thought, films, music, games, books, they're going to end up here. I didn't realize it was going to take over our entire lives. But so I thought, I'll go and do that for a couple of years and kind of learn all about this mobile technology, with the intention of coming back to music with all the answers. But the best laid plans than that. So then I worked for that company for a couple of years, worked for some startups, and then the last company I worked with for was a company called Millennial Media, which I'm sure many people know.
Remember, yeah.
And that was an amazing time. In fact, it was like being back in the music industry, because it was very early in mobile advertising.
I was at Full Screen at the time that you were
at
Millennial.
Yes,
Yeah, so you
Mark
remember
Slade.
Full Screen,
Yeah, of course. So that was an amazing time. I joined the leadership here in Europe and was kind of charged with building out the marketing function here. And we then had 4.5 years where we went through an IPO. We acquired a bunch of companies. I ended up running marketing globally for them up to the point we sold to AOL in 2015. Okay. And that was the point of which I knew that was my moment to leave. And have a pause and think what's going to happen next. And I'd always wanted my own company. And having spent my entire career in marketing, the obvious thing was marketing agency. So even though I'd never worked agency side, you kind of sometimes the imposter syndrome kicks in and thinks, oh, should I have done that? But thankfully I surround myself with good advisors who have done that.
Yeah.
And
I just think you have to have worked in an agency. You have to just know how to do marketing, right?
And I think but I've also employed lots of agencies over my career. So I think in lots of things you base how you show up based on the good and the bad you've experienced. So I know from being client side what good looked like from an agency partnership. So I've tried to build out our team and our approach in that way.
Cool. So Too Many Dreams. Firstly, where did the name come from? And secondly, what do you do?
People always ask about the name. I think naming a company is...
It's a very pretty name.
Thank you.
It's very memorable as well, isn't it?
Exactly, yes. And I think I did get a bit obsessed because so many people wondered about it. And I'm like, why is it an interesting name? I think it's an interesting name because dreams are emotive and we all have them. And so there's an immediate resonance there. And I think also this word "too many dreams," the sentence almost doesn't finish, so you have to finish it yourself. Now, I'm reading far too much into that, I'm sure, but where it came from was, as I say, I think it's harder to name a company than it is to name a child. Because you know, try to be interesting. And I didn't want a very Ron Sill name or like, you know, lots of agencies are initials and all that sort of thing. I was a sole founder, so it was kind of my choice. And I literally woke up having dreamt it. And I thought it was a bit stupid, and I'd had all these other ideas. But I kept coming back to this notion that, you know, we work with startups and scale-ups and often, you know, in almost all cases, directly with founders. And they have a lot of dreams. And I think, you know, this notion of dreams being limited, you know, it was a limited company, so there was this kind of play on Too Many Dreams Limited.
So it's not you lamenting your exit from the music industry?
No, not I probably do have too many dreams. But I think also for me, it was this notion that dreams are, you know, they're goals, but without a plan. And so what we're there to do is to try to harness that and build some plans around stuff. And I believe that, you know, marketing can help those dreams come to life. So that was the name came from.
And how long have you been in business now?
8 years. Since 2016 I started it. So yeah, some highs and lows over that time. But yeah, so what we do is as I say, I would say we breathe life into B2B tech brands. And so what that means is we build marketing strategies and kind of execute those strategies to build brand awareness, build value, and, you know, ultimately kind of take them on a journey to, you know, wherever they need to be, and kind of exit or some sort of event. So yeah.
You mentioned highs and lows there, and we're nearly 6 years in business now at Six Sales. And when I first started the company with Karen, my wife, loads of people reached out and wanted to have a coffee. Now, some of those were just being supportive, but quite a lot of them were just really interested in what it was like. Like, I think I was 6 or 8 months into running a business, because I think there's a lot of people out there in our industry that would love to start a business, but they haven't just made the leap, or they're a little bit sort of like nervous. Is it the right thing to do? So I'd love to dig into those highs and lows that you mentioned there, because I think that a lot of people would be interested in those. So if you were to name one or several of the highs of running your own business, what would they be? And then on the flip side of that, what are the drawbacks that people should be looking out for before they make the leap?
Yes, that's a big question to unpack.
Yeah.
I think so highs, there's lots. I think, you know, when you win a new client, that's a high. I think it's a cliche, but doing great work with good people. Yeah. I think I've been very lucky that the team we've built, both kind of the full-time team and the kind of the talent, the network of talent we have around us to deliver the work, is absolutely fantastic. You know, I think it's they're all at the top of their game. You know, they've had distinguished careers already, and then they've decided, you know, to be freelance. So that gives us this amazing network that we can tap into, and that our clients really benefit from. So that's a huge high, I think. And I'm very obsessed with culture and kind of what it means. And so for me, building Too Many Dreams, it was always another reason not to have an initials. It was not supposed to be about me. I want to build I want to have a business that people are proud to say they work for, and for that to mean something. So that sort of stuff, and that's what kind of I focus on a lot, and that's what.
And what about personally, like for your own sort of quality of life or work-life balance, if there is such a thing as people call it? How's that been?
Yeah, I mean, I think being your own boss gives you. It's an interesting dichotomy. You get the freedom of making the choices you want when you want, but you also it never stops. You know, so I think I'm fortunate now. You know, with the team we've got, and certainly Lucy, our client account manager, she's fantastic, and so, you know, I'm able now to start having holidays and taking time off and actually switching off. But those first few years, it's very difficult to do that. I mean, the funny thing is, a good friend of mine said when I launched Too Many Dreams, he said to me, well, you work all the hours God sends you anyway, so why didn't you do it for yourself? And that's very true. But I think when you're inside a company, you can choose to stop, or there's always more work, but you can choose to turn off. Whether it's your own business, there's a feeling of this is all on my shoulders. And certainly then when you start hiring a team, you're then responsible for their lives too. And so that feeling is, there's a responsibility there.
When I started my first company when I was 19, I basically turned the third bedroom in our house into an office, and it was before mobile phones. This is dating me now badly, isn't it? But so I had a phone system for the business installed, and one of the phones was in the third bedroom, and one of them was downstairs, just in case I happened to be downstairs making a cup of tea when the phone rang. And one of the downsides I would say, I've always worked hard at every business. I've always probably gone over and above. I just like working. I don't know, maybe I'm a bit weird, but one of the things that I lost was that Friday feeling. You know, when you work in an office or you work sort of 9 to 5 or thereabouts, and then you go home Friday and it's quite exciting because I've got the whole weekend ahead. Because I was working from home anyway, I didn't go anywhere. I was basically still at home.
Yeah.
And the phones were still there. And unbelievably, clients would sometimes even ring you on the weekend as well because they knew that they could. And so you don't get that amazing Friday feeling. And I'm wondering if maybe a lot of people don't get that now because of the remote working. A lot work is coming into the home a lot more, isn't it? Like whether that be on a full-time hybrid basis. So I'm wondering if maybe the Friday feeling is a thing of the past.
I think quite possibly it is. And I think, and again, I think that's one of the hard things about, we had an office and we gave it up last year because we just weren't going in enough. But now we're very conscious about how do we get the team together? How do we spend time together? How do we, because of that culture and that connection? And I don't think you can get it the same way on a Zoom. But also, I think you're right. It is being mindful of, we can email all day and all night now. So
I did email you quite. I know actually it was this morning, but I was writing that email last night. Yeah.
I think one of the best things that the email platforms have done is do send later.
Yeah.
Because now I'm just conscious if I'm someone who I'm a night owl naturally, so I'll be working late or I'm more inclined to work late. But then I can just go, well, I'll send that in their hours tomorrow, and that's
very respectful to do so. I think, isn't it as well? Because it's all very well saying to people you don't have to look at it until the morning, but if it pops up and people do see it, people's minds are naturally going to sort of shift towards it sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
So what are some of the downsides then to running a business? There's always the other side of the coin, which I think people are more nervous about.
Yes, there is always that, isn't there? I think. Well, like I said, that responsibility, and I think the responsibility is not just for your team, but for your family as well. I'm married with 2 boys, and you haven't got that steady income of, knowing every month you're going to get a paycheck. So, that sort of responsibility, and that comes with, that can come with some real challenges. So, it was a good few years ago now, 2019, I think. Well, I'd always said to friends, I won't ever get depressed because I'm a heart on the sleeve type person and I talk to anyone about anything. But 2019 I think was as close as you could say I could have got to a kind of full-on breakdown. And I think that was probably largely driven by stress of work. We had the end of 2018, it was the first, touch wood, first and only client we'd ever given notice to. Good friend of mine said there's a quote from Mad Men, which is the day you win a client is the day you start losing them, which may be true, but I think I'm very proud of the fact that we've worked with a lot of our clients for
it's quite a depressing thought, isn't it?
It is. It's true. It is. But we've worked with clients 3, 4, 5 years now, and that's really, again, that brings me joy. But back then, the end of that year, we'd, I think everyone, people work hard, try to do a good job. And I just realised we weren't the right partner for this client. So, as I say, it was the only time I'd given notice. And then that was a bit of a kind of what you might call a messy breakup. And
was it financially difficult to
there
give
was
notice
there
as
was
well?
financial challenges involved in that. It also, my lawyer at the time, solicitor at the time, was quite bullish, and he found out the company wasn't doing very well, and he was like, "Well, we'll just do a winding up order. We'll close them down." And I'm like, "There's 16 people working for this business. There's no way I'm going to do that." So I want to negotiate it and try to get to a place that we could. But and I think there was other stuff going on in my life, and it just wasn't in a good place. And thankfully, my wife was training to be a therapist at the time, and she recognised that. And I had actually contacted the NHS myself, and I think that what's the real shame, particularly as you see, I saw a stat this week that there's 4 times as many men as women who are now taking their dying through suicide, which is terrible. And so if you get to the point of yourself actually reaching out for help, and your only avenue really is the NHS, and love it as I do, you have to wait months to be seen, and which is terrible, because that's the point you're making. That outreach is when it really matters.
You probably haven't planned ahead, right? This
No,
is like,
exactly.
It's now crisis
yes,
level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the only therapy they offer is cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, which I know works for some people, but I'm someone probably like you who's, I'm all into kind of productivity, and I triage my day every single day with Kanban and things like that. So I didn't need more frameworks. I needed help, and so that didn't really work. But as I say, my wife found a therapist, and I think that was, that saved me. And just going to them and talking to them for, I can't remember how many months it was, but also doing that, I think two things I'd say with that is, first of all, it's amazing how much you unpack the stuff you've carried with you for, 10, 15 years. Like this thing came up, something that happened I won't go into, that happened to me when I was back working in music. And it came up in this conversation sort of 15 years later. And I was like, have I really been carrying that with me all this time?
I've got a friend going through therapy at the moment, and he's said the same thing. He said things that happened in his childhood that he didn't even realise that he remembered are kind of causing him to behave in a certain way now.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think the other thing that's brilliant about having therapy, and I think we should talk about this much more.
Definitely.
I think, the Americans are quite good in that, my therapist, and I don't think we are there yet, but we're getting there. But I think a good therapist, and I think that's difficult to find the right one. Again, I was very lucky that Louise sort of did that for me. One you could afford, one the right sort of person, right sort of personality. But once you've done it, it's sort of there always. Like, my therapist, it's like, I might not speak to him for years. I did actually get in touch with him, early last year, because I was like, I just feel like, and because then you're kind of switched into your more how you're feeling, and that you might need that little bit of a top up, and you can reach out to them. Because I think the other thing is, I talk to friends now in retrospect about that time, and when they realise how bad it was, they're like, why didn't you contact me? And I often see this in sort of, you and I are both in kind of industry WhatsApp groups, and people are very well-meaning to say, oh, if you're going through something, reach out, contact me.
Yeah.
And I said to my friend, I was like, at that point, I just did not want to do that.
No.
That was the last thing on my mind. The thing on my mind was to crawl under the duvet and hide away and not. But at the same time, you're trying to run a business and try to be high functioning and, turning up with, and, because I'm sure our clients didn't know anything was going on.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll find out now. They'll be like, what?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? And I've been through periods where I've wondered if I've got mental health challenges that probably need addressing, or whether it's just that I've just got a lot on, right? So having been through it and had therapy, and now maybe, as you're saying, that you can perhaps recognise when you might need it again, maybe a bit further in advance. Your wife very skillfully managed it for you last time. What advice would you give to people? Because sometimes life is just hard, and that might not be a mental health thing, and sometimes it might be a mental health thing. I mean, neither of us are experts in this, but you've been a lot closer to it than I have. So what would you say to people who are perhaps silently suffering, or thinking, do I need help, or am I just having a hard time at the moment? And how do you distinguish where one stops and one starts?
I would say you probably don't need to distinguish. I think if you are feeling like you're having a hard time, it's good to get help. And, in the same way we go to a doctor for, aches and pains or injuries, or we seek, medical help. I think that was it as well, is that growing up, I'd had friends and family who had kind of mental health issues that resulted in medical treatment. And so I didn't think I needed that. And so there was a kind of maybe an inbuilt false narrative that, that's where that leads. And actually just sitting and talking to someone. And I know, some people, it might work to talk to friends. I'm a Christian, I go to a Christian house group, and that actually helps because you can talk and be quite open with people. But I think the beauty of therapy is that it's a professional who It's amazing when you sit there and you think, God, did he say anything really in this conversation? But you know that what he is doing is actively listening and asking the right questions at the right moment, and just supporting you through that ability to process everything that's going on. And maybe it is not mental health, it's just tough. But I think life for people is tough now, with this cost of living crisis and everything going on. I think, going back to running your own business, yes, it's scary not being able to, or worry, you've got to worry about revenue and, all those sort of things. But equally, I talk to friends who are, sort of similar age to us, late 40s, early 50s, and they're worried that, if they get made redundant, they're suddenly sitting out of work for a year. And you think, how, it's tough. So,
I mean, there was a time when I started my first business where it was a big risk, because now I'm completely reliant on all of our own revenue, and I left a fairly stable job. But is there such thing as a stable job anymore? Like, jobs are not as stable as they once were, right? There's so many redundancies across the industry that maybe the idea of a stable job for life, or at least a job for 10 years, but doesn't exist as much as it perhaps once did.
No, I'm sure it doesn't. And without dwelling too much on the negative, I think I would always, in fact, with our two boys, I already know my thing with them is like, whether you choose to go to university or not, I think there's lots of upside of going to university. Certainly when we were young, because you get that huge worldly experience. But actually just set up your own business, start your own, forge your own way, make your own mistakes, learn from them.
Yeah.
That sort of autonomy it certainly suits me. I'm sure it doesn't suit everyone, but I thrive on it.
Just before we move off this subject, because I think it is really important, and thank you so much for opening up about it, because there probably isn't enough conversation about it. That put stiff upper lip and put a brave face on it, and don't burden people. And that's kind of my question, really, because I've got friends that I could, like, probably on one hand, that I would say are my really, really close friends, and then I've got like tons of people that I know, let's say. But I personally, when I've been struggling, wouldn't reach out to them, because I wouldn't want to burden them with my problems, because they've got their own problems, right? So the point you made there, that when you work with a therapist, they're a professional, so they kind of train for that, and also you're paying them, so you don't feel like you're putting on your mates, right? Is that something that you kind of felt, that you wouldn't want to speak to your mates because you didn't want to unload, or that?
Yeah, I mean, I talk to I'm lucky. I've got a wonderful network of friends. Like, I think would have been called a social butterfly. Another good friend referred to me. She wrote in a card, and I said to her, "That's what I'm going to have on my grave," which was "Celebrator of Life." I think that's a good thing to think about. But I think the difficult thing with friends is you have to pick your moment, or you try to pick your moment. You might turn up in a situation, and we talk a lot about, one of our values at work is empathy, and how important that is. And I think having empathy for when you walk into a situation where you've got something you want to talk about, but the other person might not. Equally, when the roles are reversed, if you think you want to lean into a conversation that you feel they need to have, but they might not be in that space, again, that's very difficult. Whereas I think with the construct of a therapy situation, you both know what you're there for.
Yeah.
And actually,
you're going through that, though, do you have the clarity of mind, and are you able to still be empathetic enough to, you're struggling yourself, and like, to then think, well, what's my mate going through? What's their life look like? What does their daily struggle look like? And is it right now to reach out? Or I don't know.
Well, like I say, when I was going at that
tough.
low point, I didn't want to talk to my friends.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it's shame or uncertainty, or that fear that you're exposing failure or perceived failure. I mean, we weren't actually failing at the time at all. I think I just had a lot on my plate. And I think at that time as well, I didn't have the network of advisors I have now, which I think, again, going back to your question about setting up a business, I think, well, it's funny. I know lots of friends who've set up businesses with friends. It's interesting you set up with your family, because Louise and I tried that for a little bit and then decided we'd rather stay married than so. And then you hear,
Well, I met my wife at work, and then we've worked together 3 times since, so it feels quite normal to us.
Yes, okay, good.
But yeah, I hear you. There's a lot of people that say, "How do you manage that?"
Yes, exactly. But then, so as a sole founder, there's good and bad about that. But I think now I have an amazing network of, guide consultants people who kind of support me in different areas and kind of help where I'm not strong. So, I think
fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for opening up about that. That's I think that's really useful for other people, perhaps might be struggling, and to hear other people's experiences of that, and lived experiences. I don't think there is enough. As you say, perhaps the US is a little bit more open, and maybe British a little bit more reserved. But I think just hearing somebody else that's been through it, and just knowing that it will be okay, right? This too shall pass, as they say.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't maybe necessarily always feel like that in the moment, but you're doing okay now, right?
Yes, I mean, it's not something I talk about. I haven't people who listen to this might be surprised that I talked about that, but I think it is important. And I won't go into that. But we've seen friends that we've lost because of those sort of situations. So I think the more people talk about it, the more people, it becomes normal to talk about.
Yeah,
the better. But
and. Yeah, absolutely. So we should probably talk about marketing, since that's what we both do. Yeah. Because I mean, I could talk to you for another couple of hours about this, I'm sure. But we said we were going to have a chat about marketing, so let's do that, shall we?
Yes, absolutely.
What are you most excited about in B2B marketing today?
Wow, that's a great question. I think. From our perspective, I'm always excited. We work with kind of emerging technology brands and kind of, as I say, startups, scale-ups. That sort of pre-post Series A is sort of our sweet spot. So I'm always excited by that. I'm excited by the tech. There's a phrase that's, again, Americans don't really use it, neophiliac, which is this idea of being excited about what's next. And I think that's definitely the team and I have that feeling. So when we get to work with new clients who are trying to solve difficult problems, that's exciting. From a marketing perspective, I think, and particularly B2B, I think there's a growing value in strategy and good strategy. I think I've always said, despite I'm probably pushing a rock uphill here, a bit Sisyphean, but I always say we're a marketing agency, not a PR agency or a content studio. And the reason I say that, partly because I was always a marketeer. And so we have subject matter experts in those sort of more tactical things. But for me, the strategy is key. It's that strategy piece that comes first. And so, whenever we work with a new client or whenever we're, building out a project of work, it will start with that strategy and that, looking at the competitor space, looking at your audience, trying to understand, where it is they engage, how they make decisions, and then how you influence them. In fact, to be honest, I think working with startups is very similar to when I worked with kind of young bands when they were first starting. It's the same sort of thing. It's like, okay, understanding what is it about this artist, this technology, this whatever that's unique.
That must be super tough with an artist, right? Because some of it's subjective and some of it's so subjective as well, isn't it? Like, so let's take Taylor Swift, right? Her music is not my sort of music at all. I listen to things like Interpol and The Killers and stuff like that, and then there's suddenly this pop sensation, and I think she's brilliant. Song after song after song, that I really like this. Now, I couldn't tell you why or how that's happened and why I've sort of moved into a different genre. And I'm not alone, right? She's a billionaire.
She's doing very well.
How do you know what it is about an artist that's going to make them successful or not, or makes them different, or? I mean, that's probably a podcast in its own right.
Yes, another thing I could talk wax rhapsodic
so hard,
about,
isn't it?
Yes, I think again, talking, across whatever sort of marketing, it is about understanding, either the person or the technology or whatever. So back, with music, it was understanding where they were coming from, what they were trying to do. And I think it's something I really do miss about not working music anymore, is that exposure to young, early bands. And, my family and friends used to say to me, okay, Stephen, who's next? And it was like, I had quite a good track record of saying, okay, Coldplay are going to be big.
I worked in music when the Arctic Monkeys first came out, and people were like, oh, who are they then? And then now look at them,
Yes, exactly. So and
when there's a little bit earlier.
Yes, and when you see some artists, you think that's definitely going to happen. I remember seeing Katie Tunstall at an industry kind of preview. I think it was only just when she'd been signed, and she was signed by a label I worked with, Relentless, which was more of a kind of urban label, so it wasn't a kind of traditional signing for them. And this was early 2000s, and it was at Notting Hill Arts Club, which anyone's been to, is a tiny little basement venue, and there wasn't even a stage; it was like a little blocks. And she got up, and she was had a guitar, And I mean, this is a bit cliche now, but back then no one had seen it before. And she started off just playing acoustic, and it was like, people are sort of talking or not paying much attention. And then she got into her looping and doing her pedals and all that stuff. And suddenly it went silent, and you just saw at that moment, you're like, yeah, she's going to be huge.
Yeah.
And so I think when you see stuff like that, and the same way I was fortunate to see Coldplay at the Scala in King's Cross, around there before their first album. And I remember Chris Martin, he got a new keyboard, and he said, everyone's seen him, knows he's very chatty, and he said, I've got this new keyboard, apologies if it makes weird noises, one day will be big enough that someone else will press the buttons for me. And it was like, how prescient were you? It's like, but
it's difficult to imagine people like Coldplay being small, playing in small venues, isn't it? And they've got so big.
But yeah, so we went off piece there again. Music is something I could talk about for hours. But yeah, I think it's trying to understand the space in which you're operating, and try to understand, almost more importantly, or as importantly, the audience you're trying to influence. I think the point of marketing is to have that empathy for where that audience is, or what their kind of worldview is right now. But you're trying to change that worldview. You're trying to bring them to your view of the world. So, I think that's.
I think as well that I was at the end of last year, the B2B Institute produced a piece of research that was looking at B2B marketing, and it was looking at the crossover between the people that saw B2B marketing communications and the people that saw sales communications. Now, obviously, in an ideal world, that overlap would be 100%, right? Because marketing should be building awareness, familiarity, trust, a level of interest, and then sales take over in a traditional B2B funnel scenario. But they found that across loads of different industries, it was actually only 16%. Now, if you think about our industry, media, ad tech, tech generally, publishers, whatever, a lot of the marketing tactics are quite broad, I would say. So Cannes 2 weeks away, right? So Cannes is a great example. So you can end up spending an awful lot of money going to Cannes, but you don't really know in advance if it's going to be worth it. Because last year, for example, I bumped into somebody I hadn't seen for ages. We had a conversation, became a client. I couldn't have planned that in advance. I couldn't have said, right, well, I'll spend this much money on going to Cannes, and then that person I'll bump into in the Cafe Roma, and then we'll have lunch, and then the numbers, as he called them, Cronenberg, and then we'll end up working together. And also, if you've got a target market, I think one of the big challenges for B2B marketers is to explain to the rest of the organization that the number of people that you're trying to target is actually really small. In B2C, we're looking at, reach is great, right? But reach isn't always necessary. If you're an ad tech company, there might be 1,000 people in the world that you need to influence in order to exit and be brilliant, right? There might only be 1,000 people in the entire world that are really important to you. But we still have this, because it's the way that marketing in the B2C world has always been. We always have this idea that more is better. So how many people looked at that piece of content? If it was 5, if it was 10, that's better. Let's say it's always about numbers, but one of those people might have been enough to do a £500,000 deal.
Well, exactly. That's what I was going to say. What's the Einstein quote about not everything that can be measured should be, or whatever it is.
Not everything that can be measured. No, everything can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted.
Exactly. And I think, so there are things, and I think that is, I've always much preferred brand marketing and that notion. We've all read the long and the short of it, and the value of the kind of the both of those approaches. And people always used to talk about brand performance, which I think it's an interesting topic, but I think it's difficult because it's different mindsets and everything else. To your point, though, if you've only got an audience of 1,000 people, they might not all even be a market at that point. Yes. And I think it's interesting your comment about the overlap of sales and marketing, because I think one of the, marketing is one to many, and it's that kind of air cover that's supposed to then hand off to sales. But I think right now that does overlap in terms of marketing has to do stuff for a lot longer to get the person kind of drive that awareness, drive that understanding. But also, I think one of the things I hate with so much what people call thought leadership, it is just glorified sales material. And it's like, that's not the function there. The sales material is when you're in the room with the person explaining all the features and benefits and why they should buy that product. thought leadership is about, again, like I say, understanding a worldview and trying to change that worldview and trying to bring people on that journey and educate them, entertain them, inform them, all of those sort of things. And I think too often you read thought leadership and then you're like, okay, yeah, I know you're just flogging your, so.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I was speaking to somebody literally just this week in the industry, a fairly senior figure, and he was saying that he thought that there should be more keynote speeches at events rather than panels. He said panels are great, but you can quite often end up with 4 people sitting nodding at each other, all agreeing with each other, and nothing really gets sort of pushed. And I think that the consensus that we came to in the conversation was that we don't mind if it's a pitch, but as long as it's backed up with some sort of, as you say, some sort of, this is a problem, this is why it's a problem, this is how we think about it. And if it leads towards what you do, then, we're all commercial animals, right? We've all got, bills to pay and stuff like that. But as long as it isn't just, we do this, do you want it? Like because that's maybe a little bit shallow. But I think talking about the areas that you work in, whether that be contextual or whether that be universal IDs or whatever it might be, or whether it be, ad serving, what are the problems that you solve, and then talk about those problems and unpack those problems.
But I think also
lead towards what you do.
But also I think with keynotes, I remember I was fortunate enough to speak at Web Summit when I was in Dublin, and I was on the digital stage and sort of 1,000 odd people, and a very good dear friend of mine from uni, Rob, is a professional actor, and so I went to see him and said, can you help? I knew this was not a presentation, it was a performance, and I said to him, can you help me do this? And actually I posted a couple of weeks ago a kind of thing on LinkedIn, a video, first ever video I did, and I need to do more of them, clearly, do more marketing of our own business. But it was about what you do before you do a presentation like that, and it was all breath work, basically. What as I say that is, I think too many keynotes become like a sales pitch, and it's like, no, you're there to entertain and make people enjoy that process. We back at Millennial, we did some presentation training, and it was those classic things where you get filmed at the beginning if you do a presentation, and then 6 months later you're filmed and you're supposed to be better. And I used to have various stories that I would tell at the end of a presentation, like stuff that was, kind of completely abstract, but had a kind of, a relevance to what I was talking about. And the presentation trainer said to me, make that the first thing you say. Because she said, and to this day I still do it. I call it Magpie Inspirations. And whenever I see stuff that's interesting, I just stick it in an Evernote. And so when I do come to present, I can go through that and go, well, what's interesting, what's relevant, and how can I tie this together as a story? Because she said, and she's right, you go watch any presentation at a conference, 90+% of people stand up and say, hi, I'm Stephen Jenkins, I'm the MD of Too Many Dreams, and I'm here to talk about blah, blah, blah.
We're here and we do this. And
it's on the slide, it's in the program, and they don't give a monkeys. So, it's like, don't say that. Stand up and say something.
Presentation research that showed that the attention peaks at the beginning and then goes into a trough during the middle, and then you get it back a little bit at the end. So using your, presenting your creds and where your offices are and how many people you've got and stuff like that, which logos you work with at the beginning, is a real waste of that key bit of attention.
Exactly.
That's the bit where you've got to really sort of grab the imagination, I think.
Well, exactly. And so when I was going all the way back to when I was at uni and was working for that magazine, I met a guy at a party and I said to him, you have to write for me because you're just, the way you tell stories is fantastic. Now, he went on to be music editor of Time Out, worked for The Guardian, and he now does social for Glastonbury, I think. But what I loved when he was writing reviews for Time Out, whether it was a live review or an album review, and there'd be sort of 3 paragraphs. And the opening paragraph, what I understand now is called the lead, had nothing to do with anything to do with this thing. And you'd read it and you'd think, what on earth is he talking about? And then the second paragraph would be what you would consider the review of the thing. And then the third paragraph suddenly brought it all back together. And there was a sort of penny drop moment. And the fact that you could do this consistently over time, I was just like, that's how you tell a story. Yeah. That's how you keep people interested. And so I went, when we work with our writers and with our clients, we're always trying to encourage, we know what we want to try to talk about, and we try, what we're trying to sell, or, the position we're trying to encourage people towards, but let's be interesting when we do it. So.
Stephen, we're out of time. I could speak to you. I think we could probably have to get you on again because
we've hardly touched on marketing, have we?
Yes, I know. Yeah, I think this episode needs to be called Music, Mental Health, and Marketing. It's
there we go.
Nice alliteration.
I was going to say, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation. As I say, let's get you on again sometime in the future, because I feel like we could then talk about marketing, which
Yes.
kind of was
Yes.
a footnote at the end of our conversation. But thanks very much for being on the Six Sales podcast. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.